Good evening. I'm Larry Ingrassia, a managing editor at the Los Angeles Times. On behalf of the Times, welcome to this evening's Ideas Exchange featuring Trevor Noah. Now, I'm sure you all know Trevor as the host of The Daily Show on Comedy Central and a shrewd observer and commentator on the political state of our country. But tonight, let's give ourselves a well-deserved break from the election and instead focus our conversation on Trevor's new book, Born a Crime: Stories from a South African Childhood. Trevor's unlikely path from apartheid South Africa to the desk of The Daily Show began with a criminal act, his birth. He was born in 1984 to a white Swiss father and a black Xhosa mother, at a time when such a union was punishable in South Africa by 5 years in prison. Living proof of his parents' indiscretion, he was mostly kept indoors for the earliest years of his life, bound by the extreme and often absurd measures his mother took to hide him from a government that could at any moment steal him away. Finally liberated by the end of South Africa's white rule, Trevor and his mother set forth on a grand adventure, living openly and freely and embracing the opportunities won by a centuries-long struggle. As Trevor describes in his book, his story is really about a mother and a son and their experiences in a time when race, language, politics, and religion were all used to separate black people from each other and from the rest of the white population. Even in the apartheid era, she taught her son to believe in himself and not to be defined by his race. Chatting with Trevor will be Sarah Rodman, the television editor of the Los Angeles Times. She's a longtime board member of the TV Critics Association and a TV junkie. Before we get started, a little housekeeping. A big thank you to the theater at the Ace Hotel, to Random House, and Skylight Books. As you may have noticed, there are signed copies of Trevor's book available for sale in the lobby while supplies last. And if you have a question for Trevor, we're going to have some time at the end for that. Ushers will hand out index cards in which you can write down your question, and they'll periodically pass by to collect them. Now, without further ado, I'm happy to welcome to the stage Trevor Noah and Sarah Rodman.
Wow, thank you for coming out, everybody.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us, taking time out of your busy holiday week to be with us, and thank you so much for taking time out of your busy potential holiday week to be with us too.
Thank you for reading the book. Just before we get into it real quick, Sarah had a galley copy of the book that was sent to her by the publisher, and I genuinely don't know how this happened, but they printed the entire book backwards. And for some reason, she read it the way it was instead of sending it back, so...
I don't like to complain.
If anything is in... You really should have. If a book is backwards, you have a good reason to be like, hey, can I get another book?
I still read it.
Yeah, so if you have the story the wrong way around, if the story ends in apartheid, then you know that's why that happened.
Such a sad ending.
It's insane that that's happening now. It's insane.
Yes, well... That's a conversation for later. But let's start with the book, shall we? So my question is, after having read the book, which all of you should get, it is incredibly inspiring and harrowing and funny, and it's just a beautiful book. So
Thank you.
Congratulations first on that. But why now? Why did you decide to write this now?
Well, I didn't decide to write it now. It only came out now.
Why did you decide to write it when you decided to write it?
I decided to write the book about a year ago. It was thanks to my friend and manager who sat with me, and he said, you tell me such great stories. You tell people such exciting stories about your life. He said, why don't you just write these things down? I said, I'm not a writer, and I tell people stories on stage and stand up. And he was like, yeah, but why don't you do that on stage? And I said, well, because some of these stories are not particularly funny. Some of them are painful. Some of them I just haven't found where the jokes are yet. I struggle to find the jokes in some stories. So I just never did them on stage. And he said, well, then you should write a book and tell the stories in a different way. And that's what I set out to do. And it took me a year. And in my head, I was like, okay, I'll start writing this book. And then I got The Daily Show, and I was like, okay, this will slow me down a little bit, but I can carry on writing the book. I mean, it's not like the election's going to be insane or anything. And then, and then a few things happened. But I was lucky that I managed to get the book out in time.
And so it covers up until until you get famous. And so my question then is there a book 2 to look forward to?
Well, right now, I mean, it's still in the early stages. It's about finding the stories. The reason I wrote this book the way I did was because essentially I looked at my life, I put stories together, and once I coalesced all of the material and sat with my editor and went through the pieces of the puzzle, I realized that it's not really the story of, it doesn't end when I become famous, although it is that in terms of a timeline, but really where this book ends is where I essentially go out into the world and I live without my mom, essentially. You know, because when I first wrote the book, when I started, this was my story. You know, I was like, I'm going to write a book about me and my life, and I have fantastic stories to tell. And then when I was done writing it, I was like, this is a book about my mom.
Yeah.
And how amazing she is.
Therapy.
And then, which I did not intend, because I always believed that I was the hero of my story. It is quite a tragic thing to discover. It's like writing a story about being a Cape Crusader only to discover that you were Robin. And essentially my mom was Batman. So that's why I wrote it to where I did, because those were the stories that essentially existed within a timeline where I was constantly in contact with my mom before I ventured out into the world.
Well, your mom wasn't only Batman, she was Wonder Woman, she was Superman, she was all of the superheroes. I mean, a protector, a disciplinarian, a partner, a good friend, and she's a remarkable person. She had a very difficult background, but throughout the book, it feels like she never gets embittered about where she's come from. And what do you attribute that to? Because it seems like you have that same quality.
I don't know. My mom, you know, even in telling me some of the stories of her life, my mom never told them in a particularly embittered way. You know, when my mom would tell me stories of, I remember once she bought me, I guess it's almost like a wild type of corn. You know, very unrefined, unprocessed, not as tasty version of popcorn. And she bought a bag of this for us to snack on. And I was enjoying it for the most part. And then she said, I love these things. They remind me of my childhood. And I said, what does this remind you of in your childhood? And she says, oh, I remember when, because this used to be the pig's food, and I would eat the food with the pigs sometimes. And I was like, I'm waiting for the good part of the story. And she said to me, no, it's the memories, you know, and I was like, what do you mean? And then she'd tell me stories of how growing up, there were times when they were so poor, and my mom lived in an extremely rural area, you know, because of the government at the time and how they had kept black people predominantly out of built-up areas and cities. So my mom lived in a homeland where there was very little, and so she would eat at times food that was meant for the pigs. But this was just how she told me the story. She never said it to me in a painful way. She never said it to me in a way that made me want to pity her. You know, she always told me a story as just that, a story. And it was a story that had gotten her to the place where we were, and that was where we were now discussing it in hindsight. And one thing my mom instilled in me was the idea that it doesn't help us to be bitter. You know, my mom would always say, you're gonna complain and be bitter and angry about a government that's oppressing you. And she says, and you should fight. She said, but why bring that anger home? She was like, you know, they're not here. They're not here for them to see your face. So she was like, you may as well go and fight with them. But when you come home, let's laugh and enjoy ourselves, because why let them spoil our private time? You know, she's like, they're not here for this. All those racist people, they're not here. So why should we still be angry? And so that's how she lived her life. She didn't believe in granting people more power than they deserved in terms of how they affect your world and your life.
And you needed to watch Rescue 911, and you couldn't be fighting while you were doing that.
Oh, yeah,
I like that
definitely.
Shatner played a big role in your childhood, that you weren't allowed to listen to a lot of contemporary music or
Yes.
consume a lot of contemporary pop culture because you grew up in a very religious household.
Yes.
And so what were the things that you held on to that you were allowed to watch back then, or
Well, I
listen
mean,
to,
you know,
besides
my,
Montel Jordan?
my mom. So my mom and I, we were a team, and we were a team through circumstance and obviously through love. But one of the reasons we were so close was because we moved around a lot, and we were often in communities where we had no social circle. You know, so she was my friend and I was hers, and so friends, you know, hang out and they have similar interests, and my interests were governed by my mom's tastes. So I lived in a world where, you know, like my mom loved Rescue 911, and I was watching Rescue 911 with her. You know, we were watching all these random shows that came in from the US, very safe, you know, network shows that were allowed to be broadcast by the government at the time, you know, who didn't restrict who restricted what we were watching, and so those things weren't. But essentially, I lived in her world, and I didn't know any different, which was great. So I didn't go, oh, I didn't think to myself, oh, I can't believe I'm forced to listen to Dolly Parton. I was like, no, I like Dolly Parton. That was my concept of, so in my world it was like Dolly Parton and Kenny Rogers. This is life, this is good times. You know, I'm singing this, I'm enjoying myself, you know. Like I'll be walking around in the house. If you ask me as a child back then, you go like, what's your favorite songs? Or I'd be like, oh, I'd sing a Dolly Parton song for you, or, you know. But that's because that was the world my mom inhabited, and that was what I knew. You know, so I never went, oh, that's a woman's world, I'm a guy. No, it was just like, this is what we do. And the biggest reason I was restricted was just because of religion. That was really it. You know, once my mom became a Christian and became born again, she was really fundamentally opposed to anything that was against her religion. And so there was no Boys to Men sex songs in my house. There was no, like, that did not exist in my world. I remember kids at school singing, and everyone knew the lyrics. And everyone was singing together, I make love to you. Like, and I was just standing there in the background like, first of all, I don't know how you all know this. And secondly, I don't know what this is. You know, if you want me to sing a song, I'll sing like Psalm 112, and that's the world that I grew up in. But because it was the only world I knew, I never felt restricted. I was just like, oh, I've got a different world, and that world is religion.
And so when that world opened up for you, you know, Trevor went on to become quite the entrepreneur, selling pirated CDs and DJing, because, you know, when that world opened up to you and you were able to listen to that music, was it just a rush? Did you just want to consume everything?
No. I hated people's tastes in music. So to give you a bit of a backstory, so in high school, I was lucky in that I made friends with a guy named Andrew. And Andrew was a white kid in school whose dad was British, and he came from a very liberal family, and Andrew, he wanted, you know, he ran a CD pirating business at school. And this was back when CD writers were brand new. I mean, this was, you know, you remember when it was like the latest technology. People were like, what do you mean you can make your own? It was amazing. You know, and CDs had come around as the uncopyable thing, the antidote to the tape, you know, the cassette tape piracy that was happening. So Andrew was conducting the piracy, and the problem Andrew had was whenever he sold CDs to black customers at school, they refused to pay him on time, and they would always say they would pay him, and then when he would come and seek payment, they would threaten him, and then he would have to write off that debt. So he was afraid. He was afraid, and I picked up on this, and I said to him one day, I said, hey, let me help you out. I said, these black people are manipulating you because they realize that you're afraid. They're good people. They just don't have the money right now. So let me be the middleman. I will handle the selling of the CDs, and I'll give you your money, and then I just take a cut off the top. I'll roll with my people, and then you just handle the business. You know, and Andrew was like, oh, that's fantastic. I don't have to talk to black people ever again. He was like, I'm fine. And we became good friends. And one of the greatest things Andrew did for me was once he quit the game, you know, I was bequeathed with his CD writer. which was huge at the time, because when the CD writers came out, you got to understand, it cost the same amount as an entire computer. That's how expensive they were. No one could afford a CD writer, and here this guy gave me the CD writer, and it was my first lesson in empowerment, essentially, because I didn't realize it at the time, but that's really what empowerment has to be. As much as people talk about taking power, power has to be given. We must never deny that in society. Power has to be given. Everyone that has voted for people to have the right to vote were those that were in power. So when black people were given the right to vote in America, it was white people who had to vote for that. When women were given the right to vote, it was men who had to vote on that. In South Africa, for Nelson Mandela to be freed, white people had to vote on that. And so oftentimes, I feel like that's lost in conversations, is people forget that power does have to be given. Yes, you can demand equal rights and you can demand that freedom, but you must never forget that the power still has to come from those who hold it. And Andrew taught me that. In this little microcosm of CD piracy, I learned that if it wasn't for him giving that to me, I would have never gone on to become a mini mogul myself.
And you say something great in the book in that regard, which I think is worth repeating as often as possible, that is the last part of the teach a man to fish proverb that nobody says.
Yes.
That if you give a man a fish, he eats for a day. If you teach a man to fish, he lives for a lifetime. But it would be super helpful if you gave him a fishing rod.
But that's what I always. Well, that's what I feel like people. That's what I feel like people ignore when it comes to diversity and all of these things that we talk about in life. People go, "Oh, you teach a man to fish and he'll eat for a day. You teach a man, you give him a fish, you eat for a day. You teach a man to fish and he'll eat forever." And it's like, no, not if you don't give him a rod. Not if you don't give him the tools. So people forget that sometimes. People forget that knowledge without opportunity is almost as pointless as not giving the person the chance. You've got to say, okay, here's the knowledge, and here is a way for you to exercise that knowledge. And Andrew taught me how to make pirated CDs, but without a writer, I would have been useless. And that was a great friendship that we shared. And if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have gotten into that business and made a lot of money. It's funny because now I'm in the entertainment industry. Back then, I was like, how can this be a crime? I was like, this is ridiculous. I was like, if it was a crime, then why would they make a CD writer and sell it? That's just makes no sense. And then I remember like years later, someone was like, it's piracy is theft. And I was like, what do you mean it's theft? It's not theft. And then they were like, if you could steal, it's like stealing somebody's car. And I was like, no, it's like copying somebody's car. I was like, if I could copy somebody's car, I would do that as well. I would do that exact same thing. But obviously I wasn't in the industry. I didn't understand it. And I think most of us don't. And that was also an example in life where I learned when you are removed from a problem or a situation, you don't understand the impact that you may have on another person's life, because that life is not real, it's an idea. And again, it was an abstract lesson for me to learn, but in my world, I never thought there was somebody on the other side.
There was no face attached to it
until
there was a face attached
to it. There was none, exactly.
And so, did you ever end up meeting any of these musicians? Montel Jordan, did you end up apologizing? I'm sorry.
I've never met Montel Jordan. I owe an apology to. I copied a lot of his music, like a lot of his music. Him and 112. Wow. Yeah, that's like I owe them a lot of money. But
send him a fruit basket. It'll be fine. You'll be fine.
But at the same time, I feel like I exposed him to a lot of people who wouldn't have had the money to buy his music originally. And if anything, I was the first streaming service. That's all I was. That's how I like to see it.
Excellent rationalization. So one thing that struck me is in almost most of the chapters, at least in the beginning, you talk a little bit about quite a bit about the history of apartheid. And I'm wondering if you felt like that was crucial for people's understanding of your story, that it's inextricably linked to your story.
Yes, that is the core of my story. Oftentimes people will say to me, why do you always bring up race? Why do you always have to bring race into it? I say, no, I don't bring race into it. Race brought me into it. I'm not going to act like I live in a world that is devoid of race, because that is a luxury I've never been afforded. That is something many people of color are not afforded, is the ability to turn it on and off as they please. So people will often say people will often say the phrase, they'll be like, oh, why you always got to talk about race? It's like, because you live it. You know what I mean? It's very different, and I can understand how irritating it may be for a person who goes, oh, that's all you talk about is race. It's like, yes, because the world that is default, for the most part, is white. And so if you're not talking about race, you're still talking about white without realizing it, because that is the default. A good example is, you look at emojis on our phones. They found that the emojis that they change, the hands, the faces, you can now pick different ethnicities. And they found that people of color are using the different ethnicity emojis, but they found white people haven't changed at all. Like they haven't, because they're now a white emoji as opposed to like a little yellow one. And the white people just haven't been using that. And then the question was, why didn't they use it? And it was because the default was already white in many white people's minds. They were like, yeah, that's me. That's exactly who I am. I know it seems yellow, but that's me. And once people of color saw an option for themselves, they exercised that option because they were like, oh, wow, there is a world where I can now exist. And so essentially, in these stories, the reason I put interstitials in the book was because I realized to tell you my story and to tell you the story of South Africa without telling you the story of apartheid is then not telling you the story at all. It's telling you Star Wars, and I say nothing about how Darth Vader came to be. I'm just like, there's a dude with a mask, he's bad. It just, you lose the essence of why you're supposed to be talking about this. And that's why I do it, because the conversations can't be had without it. The same way I believe in America, you cannot have the conversations without understanding that the foundation of a lot of what is happening and a lot of where America came from is from a place of slavery and from racism. And now a lot of people get uncomfortable because they go, well, I'm not racist, and I was. It's like, yeah, it's not that you were there. I'm not saying get in a time machine and go fix it. What we're just saying is acknowledge that the foundation of this has come from a racialized history. Just acknowledge that, so it's funny, like with the Electoral College, that's a good example. People go, this Electoral College, why does it even, and then you go, it came about because of slavery. One of the biggest examples it exists was because the South needed to be afforded assurances that they would still be able to wield as much power as they wanted without giving the vote to their agricultural workers, as they were called at the time. And so when I tell those stories, I go, if I do not give you the true context of the world we were living in, then you do not understand any parts of where I came from, because it defined every interaction. How I interacted with my mom, how my mom could live with me in public, how my parents would see each other in secret because they could be arrested at any time. And my mom, who was arrested on many occasions when she was caught fraternizing with my father. So without those stories, there is no story to tell.
And you talk a lot about being an outsider in the book, which is interesting. And the two skills that you had at your disposal, among others, I'm sure, were your facility with language and your sense of humor, obviously. How many languages do you speak?
I speak 6 currently.
And so this was a way for you you didn't feel like you belonged to any particular tribe because of your parentage. And you always felt like an outsider, but you would go up to people and launch into Zulu or launch into Afrikaans, and they'd be like, oh, you're actually part of my tribe.
Yeah.
I accept you now. When did you realize that that was an in for you?
I think very early on in life. My mom made me realize that. So I speak 6 languages. My mom speaks 9. I'm an underachiever in the family. My mom very quickly taught me by example how easy it is to manipulate somebody else's mind. And that is just by inhabiting a piece of their world. And that piece was language. My mom taught me very early on, through your accent or your language, you could penetrate a person's defenses and render them subconsciously on your side. Like they wouldn't even realize what had happened. And as a child, I started realizing this. I lived in different worlds where I didn't belong. So to give you a quick framing of this world, a lot of people think of apartheid as a simple system of racism. They go, oh, black people were oppressed. No, apartheid was perfect racism. That's what you have to understand. Apartheid was truly perfect racism. It was created and developed. It wasn't stumbled upon. The architects of apartheid in South Africa traveled the world studying the finest forms of racism. They went to the Netherlands, they went to Australia, they came to the United States, and they actually had a commission that set out to study racism and figure out what flaws had been exposed in different places and how you could galvanize racism as a rule of law. And so when they came back to South Africa, the one thing they realized was in every place around the world, there were small mistakes people had made in trying to oppress. And one mistake Americans had made in the opinions of, the architects of apartheid was they opened the door to a majority rising up against them. And if you think about it, that is what's happened in America now, right? In that every person who is not white in America was considered black or grouped into the other, the other immediately. So if you had one drop of black blood in America, you were black. What the apartheid architects realized was that is just a quick way to build up a majority against you. At some point, you will be outbred because that group is growing because any slight variation of race improves on their numbers and not yours. And so, you're going to be in a position where you're losing power. And so what they did was they realized that you should separate people not just by the way they look, but the tribe that they relate to. And so in apartheid, they even broke black people apart. So they said, this is your tribe, this is where we can trace your lineage to. You are Zulu, you are Xhosa, you are Ndebele, you are Swazi. And they separated people out. And the minutiae of race was what apartheid was based on. So my mother's a black woman, Xhosa woman. My father is white, from Switzerland. And all three of us in the family were given different racial classifications. And by that, we were also given different liberties. So my mother being black meant that she was at the bottom, complete bottom of the totem pole. She was black and she was a woman, afforded the fewest rights. My father was white and a man, and so he was afforded the most rights in the country. I was termed colored, and that's what most people of my skin tone were called in South Africa, colored. And colored people were seen as somewhat of a buffer between the black and the white, and colored people were sent off into their own groups. And this was done so intensely that over time, colored became a race in South Africa. So as much as I'm considered colored, I'm technically not colored because most colored people in South Africa have parents who are also colored and grandparents who are also colored. They don't have a black or white person within 2 generations of them. And so you can imagine now, I lived in a world where I wasn't considered the same as my mother, I wasn't considered the same as my father, but the people I was considered the same as, I had nothing in common with other than this construct that was the color of my skin. And so I realized very quickly that if I didn't find ways to blend in to different groups, I would always live my life as not just an outsider, but somebody who was shunned, so. But
it was almost always black people, which was interesting to me. It was never colored people.
No, but black people were extremely accepting. Mm-hmm. That's one thing I found till this day, is black people will be very accepting of you because most of the time black people are living lives that are not the most, enjoyable. And so, like I remember a friend of mine he said to me in school, I said, can I hang out with you guys? And he said, yes. And I said, why are you guys so nice? And he said, because who are we to say you shouldn't suffer with us? Join in, He was like, if you want to join, come and suffer. We're fine. I mean,
plenty to go around.
We can't make this a members-only club. Join in, like whatever. There's nothing to obstruct you from. And that's what I found is black people, as soon as you were willing to be a part of that world, you were, in essence, you were willing to adopt suffering. And so black people would go, if you're willing to take on the full black experience, then by all means, feel free, what I found is, strangely enough, I found I was ostracized more by people who looked like me. Because in life I've learned it's easier to be an insider as an outsider than it is to be an outsider as an insider. If you go into a group that is very obviously not yours, people will accept you because they always know that you're an outsider. And so they go, you've made a choice, and they make a conscious choice to accept you. But when you buck the trend of what your tribe has dictated, you will very quickly see resistance form. you know, and that will often be in the form of rejection. So, and it happens to everyone. If you are a black guy who immerses himself in, you know, rock and skateboarding, and there was a time when those people were ostracized in their community. You know, the same thing with white people. If you find yourself going into a world where people are like, why are you immersing yourself in a black world? You are ostracized from your community. And one of the quickest ways I found to bridge that gap was through language. You speak to somebody in their language, and half of the barriers in their mind go down immediately. You speak to somebody in their accent, and immediately they go, oh, you're just like me. You know, your skin may be tainted in a different way, but you are just like me. And that was a tool that I learned to use very quickly.
And then you made them laugh on top of that, which made you able to go between all the groups. I like that during the passage where you were in jail, you gravitated towards the older white man.
Yes. Well, I learned very quickly, if you make people laugh, laughing is a tacit agreement. Whether you realize it or not, if you're laughing together, it means you are agreeing in that moment on what funny is. When I was in jail, I realized in jail, everything gets watered down to its very, very basics. You know, there is no nuance in prison. In prison, they go, you with the black group, you with the white group, you with the Indian group, or you're with the colored group. And that's the way it was in South Africa. And it's the same way in America. You have to choose your group when you go into jail. You know, you can't walk in there and be like, well, I know that I may look this way, but I've been exposed to many cultures, and so due to my deep love of hip-hop, I will be embedding myself with, it's like, no, white people over there, black people over there. It's really simple, and the tribes become redefined. But I found in that environment, like when I was in a prison, when I was in jail, not prison, when I was in jail, I was like, I'm gonna go stand with the white guys, because I was like, I feel like I can hold my own in this environment, because most of them were there for white-collar crimes. I was like, I don't think any of them can throw a punch. And so
There it is.
I know it's prejudiced, and I judge myself for it, because many of them could have been very dangerous, but on the face of it, they weren't. And you know, in that moment, that's where instinct kicked in, and then I made a decision.
Well, a smart one. So let's talk about Hitler. Not that one.
I love how you segue so seamlessly.
Thank you.
There are some people in this room who are
It's
just
a
like, all right,
gift.
wait, prison, and then, okay, wait, what happened
Yeah,
now? Let's talk
yeah.
about Hitler. All right.
Just stream of consciousness.
Yes. You know what's strange is in 2016, I feel like that's a conversation a lot of people are having now. It's just way more than we should be. Let's talk about Hitler. Let's chat about Hitler real quick.
But this is one of the funny, sort of simultaneously most funny and also sort of tragic stories in the book. I just loved it. Can you recount a little bit of it for your audience?
The story of my friend Hitler.
Yes.
So, I have a friend, and his name is Hitler. The
Hitler
reason
was a
I wrote
black
about
man.
this, the reason I wrote about this in the book, was because one day I was chatting to a friend of mine in the UK, and I had never told this as a story, because honestly, this was not a highlight in my life in any way. And so one day in conversation, it was actually comedian Eddie Izzard, and we were hanging out in Edinburgh, and we were talking about what we had done previously before comedy, and I told him I used to DJ, and he said, oh, what was that like? And I said, oh, we had a good time, and I had a troupe of dancers, and he said, oh, you know, where were they? Were you still friends? I was like, yeah, I know them. I said, my best dancer was Hitler, and he was really cool, and then he stopped me, and he said, sorry, it sounded like you said Hitler there. And I said, oh yeah, because I said Hitler. And he said, why would you give somebody the nickname Hitler? And I said, no, we didn't give him his nickname. That was his name. His government name was Hitler. You know, it was his first name on his identity documents. And he looked at me and he said, what kind of person would call their child Hitler? And I said, well, clearly Hitler's mom. And his mind was just, he couldn't, and we sat down, and that's really what inspired the story, because I had to tell him the details of the story. And it was basically as simple as this. He asked me all these questions that I had to answer, and he said, how could somebody call their child Hitler? What a disgusting thing. She's clearly a woman who's abhorrent. And I said, no. I said, you're working under the assumption that Hitler's mother knows what Hitler means. And this, in essence, spoke to the education system in South Africa at the time. The apartheid government did not feel that black people deserved to be educated. You know, they did not feel that black people deserved the right to access all types of education. So they restricted black people to learning about agriculture and menial labor because that was the only career path a black person could have in the country. The obvious downside of this is you have a nation that is not educated in terms of history, in terms of the sciences, and so they are left to their own means and devices. And so many people in South Africa, many black South Africans, operated from hearsay and what they would pick up here and there in a newspaper. And so Hitler's a good example of that. My grandfather didn't know who Hitler was. He knew that there was a thing called Hitler, and he thought it was an army tank. Because he heard that the Germans and Hitler's advancing and Hitler's winning, and in his world, he thought that a Hitler was a powerful army tank that was helping the Germans win the war. And now anyone would say, but that's ridiculous, surely everybody knows. But that's what I realized, is it's like, no, everybody doesn't know. Everybody doesn't come from the same place. And through telling the story, you know, the one reaction I got was, Eddie said to me, he said, yeah, but it's still disgusting. Once she learned this, why wouldn't she change his name? And I said, first of all, she didn't learn it. She still doesn't know. I'm not going to tell her. And secondly, and more importantly, it is a tough conversation to have, but you realize that that's how many African people feel about names that are commonly used in society today. When people have names like Henry, then you go named from the king. When people have the name Leopold, that is the king of Belgium who in the Congo exacted countless acts of you know, slaughtering the people. And what was even more tragic to me was when I would say to somebody, I would go, why is Leopold any worse? These are all extremely bad people, but why is Hitler the worst? And the answer I would always get is because he killed 6 million Jewish people. And I'll say, yes, that's correct. Then I'll say, how many Congolese people did Leopold kill? And the answer would always be scores, many, a large number. And I said, that in of itself tells you something, where all through history, even the way we tell it now, the black life has possessed so little value that even in telling of an atrocity, the numbers are not tallied up. You know, the numbers are not counted. It is just many people were killed. The only time black people were really counted in history with their deaths was on the slave ships, and that was because they were a product. People had to calculate their losses at sea. And I came to realize that, you know, it's not a conversation about diminishing somebody else's pain. It's not one of going, my suffering is worse than yours. It's not that. It just made me realize in that moment how adverse the effects had been. Apartheid, robbing people of their education. These people not only didn't know how bad that person was, but they didn't know he even existed. And now you go to somebody and you say, why don't you feel the pain I feel? And they go, because I was never even allowed to explore your pain. And so that's how I came to have a friend whose name is Hitler. And he doesn't, like in his world, it doesn't bother him because he also didn't get to go to a good school. He does not know of it in that way. You know, he just exists the way he is. He's a handsome black guy named Hitler, very good dancer. And I think that was one of those moments where I struggled with it because I was like, this is a tough thing. How do you know? Because now when I meet him, I can't now act like I don't know his name. You know, but I bear the guilt of like a Western world that has come with me, where the people go, what do you call him? What do you call him? But I still have to, hey, what's that, Hitler? You know, what do you save him as in your phone? You know, big H. What do you like? But that was one of the most powerful stories in my life, where I didn't even realize what I had stumbled upon, and upon analyzing it, I came to realize, again, the ills of a system that had oppressed people, and also, as an auxiliary idea, one where we live in a world where there are so many atrocities that we do not acknowledge when it comes to the black life, and that is a painful realization to come to.
I'm supposed to remind you all that the ushers are collecting questions on index cards, and we're going to take those in about 20 minutes. So if you got a question, hand it to the ushers who are apparently going to collect them. Talking about pain, there's a lot of it. And I'm curious, once you were done or while you were in the process of doing it, were there things that you thought, oh, this is too much? Maybe I won't include this, or you felt like it had to be all out
In terms
there?
of writing the book?
Yeah. Because there's a lot of sad stories in the book, tough ones to read.
You know, once I committed to writing the book, I found myself in a place where, as soon as I got to the first painful story, I stopped, and then I genuinely grappled with it. I was like, do I not tell the people? Do I gloss over this? Do I find a way to not talk about this? But then I realized if I did that, there would be stories later on in the book that wouldn't make sense. You wouldn't get a full understanding of who I am as a person. You wouldn't know the world that I lived in. And so then it would almost become pointless. Why write a book and why share stories of my childhood with people if those stories would be photoshopped? It's extremely painful. Sharing stories, revisiting growing up in a home of domestic abuse, talking about going through that pain is not something that I enjoyed. But I do know in sharing those stories, that's the key word there for me, is sharing, I came to realize how many people also had those stories. And that was something that struck me very early on, was in the specificity of telling a story, sometimes you can explore the broadest themes. I've met people from other continents who go, I lived a life almost exactly like yours. I've met people who said, hey, I grew up, in a single parent household, and my mom was also abused, before we left. I grew up in a world where I was also terrified. I grew up in a world where my life was also one of poverty and pain. And the biggest reason I share it is because I hope that people will find solace in that. We don't talk about these things enough. My mom said it the most eloquent way. I once asked my mom why she would tell people that, and she would say this in a very flippant manner almost. She would very easily tell a complete stranger that her husband, at the time, or after she had divorced him, but she'd tell them of how her husband had beaten her. And this was my stepfather, not my biological father. And she would tell people these stories, and I would go, why would you tell that? Why, and she'd be like, why wouldn't I? I was telling them a story, and I thought I should tell them that. And I said, but it's embarrassing. And my mom said to me, she said, let me tell you something, honey. She said, I refuse to live in a world where I must be embarrassed because a man is unable to control himself. I must be embarrassed because a man seeks to impose his will on me through strength. I must be embarrassed because he is committing a crime. And she said, I refuse. She said, how can I hang my head in shame when I've done nothing wrong? And I realized that that's essentially what's happened, is we live in a world where the shame is carried by all the wrong people. We are ashamed when we are suffering. We are ashamed when we are abused. We are ashamed, when we are in spaces of violence. We are ashamed because we feel like we are complicit in that. It's a strange thing that happens in our minds. There are women who are friends who don't even tell each other about instances of abuse in their lives because everybody wants to exist in a space of having a perfect relationship, because if you don't exist in that space, we often feel like that is our fault. We are complicit in that pain or that non-perfect world that we exist in. But I realized when you share it, you will find so many people putting their hands up and going, yeah, me too. Yes, me too, me too, me too, me too, me too. And the biggest reason I tell the stories and the reason I share it openly, and I do it with everything in my life, whether it be, struggling with depression or domestic abuse or whatever it may be, I share it with you so that you know that you're not alone. I don't know where the message will reach. I don't know where it will resonate. But I know somewhere out there there's somebody who's hiding, and when they hear that sound, they go, oh, I can come out because somebody else is going through the same thing that I am. And so that's why I shared all of those stories, because if it connects with one person, then that's one person that doesn't have to suffer alone.
So there is a lot of talk in the book about being an outsider and insider, what you were talking about earlier, and I was curious if that sort of chameleonic quality that you had to have to ingratiate yourself as you moved around into different groups was actually something that was useful when you took over The Daily Show, coming as an outsider from that.
Yeah, I think being a chameleon is something that sticks with you in life. When you're used to being an outsider, you're used to the scrutiny that comes with being an outsider. You are used to the odds that are stacked against you as an outsider. And The Daily Show was no different. I came into an environment where, from the very onset, and understandably, people were going, "Who the hell are you?" I came from a space where, like, the greatest irony was, where people go, this nobody, and you go like, well, it's not a nobody. He's known in other places in the world. And he's like, which places? You're like, well, the rest of the world. That's where. But you realize very quickly that America is and was its own world, which is something that I feel needs to change. And if ever you realize it, it's now, because essentially the thing I've always experienced, and I'm glad, because I came from a small country, we've always had to be cognizant of the world. We've always had to know what is out there because it's always affected us. And America has been in a very privileged position where for so long, nothing affected America. America affected the world. It's the reason America could take an isolationist approach during the wars. Initially it was like, that's the war of Europe, we're not involved. When America got involved, it became a world war. And that's true. And I realized that when I came in, very quickly, the people were going, who are you? You're not supposed to be here. This is not what this role here is not meant for you. You talk funny, you don't look the way we know this position to look. Why should we even listen to you as a human being? And these are all reactions that I have as well. Don't get me wrong, like people always go, weren't you angry? I go, no. I do the exact same thing. We're humans. Humans are resistant to change. That is what we do. I remember once, I used to watch The Bold and the Beautiful with my grandmother, and one time they changed Ridge's brother Thorn to another guy, and he came and I was like, that is not Thorn. And I refused to accept it for a very long time. I was like, I don't care. I don't care. He's not Thorn. I know who Thorn is. That is not Thorn. And so that's fundamentally who we are as people. So I understood that. What I also understand, though, is with time comes a relationship. With time, you establish yourself and you learn. If you are willing, you learn from your audience. And so, the journey on The Daily Show has been just that. It's a journey. It is one that I'm glad Jon Stewart had the foresight to warn me about. He told me ahead of time, he said, just be ready, the storm is coming. He said, I know it because I went through it when I took over from Craig Kilborn. He says, no one will tell you that, and no one remembers that, because we didn't live in an internet age back then. But he says, I remember it. So when you come in here, everyone's going to tell you, you can't fill my shoes, you can't do what I'm supposed to do. And he said, but that's why I want you here, because you're not going to try and do that. He said, you don't worship me, you enjoy my work, but that was the truth, is that Jon and I got along as comedians, and I was never enamored by him. I was like, this guy is amazing at what he does, but I wasn't like, oh my God, it's Jon Stewart. I was just like, yeah, this guy's doing good shows, really funny, and that was it. And I think that's why we got along as people. And so Jon was like, I don't want someone in this role who's going to try and continue my show because I think my show is done. So I realized that over time, I had to establish that with an audience, but then I had to learn an audience as well. You know, you can't just come in and not let the other side shape you. It is a conversation. That's what comedy always is in my world. So that's where being a chameleon helps you, because a chameleon maintains its form, but what it does is it subtly changes its color in order to, you know, blend in with its environment. It's still a chameleon, it is still a reptile, it still exists the way it does, but all it's done is learned how to make the environment notice it just a little bit less, and when you are part of the environment, then you can now be a change within that environment.
And it's not like you came in during a time that had anything interesting going on. Like it was hard or anything.
I think you know what? I think I came in at the perfect time. People ask me that question all the time. They go, was it good or bad coming in at the time you did during the election? You know, it was ramping up. I think I came in at the perfect time because I came in when everything was fundamentally opposed to everything America had always believed it was meant to be. You know, when I first got to The Daily Show, anyone who worked there could tell you, I immediately recognized something in Donald Trump. I mean, we did a piece on it in my first week. I was like, that guy's from my country. I was like, he may have that skin color, but I know that. That's an African dictator. I can see it. And initially it's funny because it's like, oh, this is crazy, and you find people saying the same things, and you know they have a similar rhetoric and a similar ascent to power. But the one thing I was constantly told was, yeah, but that can't happen here. Everyone said that. They said, but this is America. That can't happen in America. The primaries are designed for this. We have silly summers all the time. You know, Sarah Palin and the Herman Cains, they fall away. We go crazy in the summer, and then we settle down when the winter comes, and we vote for the right person. And every time I saw Donald Trump on TV, I said, this guy reminds me of home. I can see him doing it. And every time people were like, you clearly don't get it. And I won't lie, I started believing them. I was like, well, obviously you know something I don't. You know, I was like, I don't get your polls. I don't know why you believe people when you just ask them who they're going to vote for. That seems like the most ridiculous thing in my head. But essentially, you know, people, this is the best way I can put it is, it was an advantage because when you come in as an outsider, you become a child. You know, that's something that you learn by being an outsider, and that's why I always try and explore new spaces and environments. But it's also the reason I try and learn new languages all the time. Because whenever you learn a new language, you have to learn humility again. You have to learn that you are not in command as you know yourself to be. You're in a space where you are a child. You can barely structure sentences, and you are at the mercy of another person's world. And when you are in that space, you ask questions. Why do you have the masculine and the feminine in French and German? Why does it end in an E or an I? Why? You ask the questions that everyone else takes for granted. And that was the same thing for me. I came in and I said, but why? Why do the polls get trusted? People said, because. And I said, but why can't someone change their mind? They were like, well, that's really unlikely. And I was like, but why? And it's just like a little kid. Kids will often expose your, you know, you think you know everything until you get a child, and they'll expose your way of thinking because kids don't accept it. They just go, but why? And you're like, and then at some point you're like, I don't know, okay? I don't actually know. It's just the way it's been. I don't know. And I think I came in at the perfect time because it was something that nobody was familiar with. I was familiar with it, and I had to learn to go through that process. And if anything, now I feel like it's almost like my purpose has clicked into gear, because around me I see many people who are in shock and fear, and they're like, what the hell, we've never dealt with this before. And you know, I feel like it's that scene in Ghostbusters where it's like, oh, I know, I've got this, I know how to handle this, don't worry. I know, you know, before people were like, what are you doing? I was like, I don't, but now it's like, oh, no, I know what this is, don't worry. That's a class 4, I know exactly what that is. So I'm enjoying being in that space now.
So you're going to share some tips with us for the future, is what you're saying?
Well, yeah, we've lived it in South Africa. I can tell you that already. You know, like, and that's why I say America can no longer to exist in isolation, because Brexit was a forecast of this. I struggled to get people to even think of Brexit or talk about it, because like people were just like, yeah, that's England, and I was like, yes, it's happening all over the globe though. It's like a virus that's spreading. Right-wing populism, right-wing nationalism is spreading around the world. It is happening in Austria. It is growing in Australia. It is rising in Germany, in England, in France. I was like, why do you think it won't happen in America. And people were like, because that's not what this country stands for, and that's not what our ideals are about. And it's like, and then I go, well, again, you're making a very dangerous mistake, because you are not acknowledging that a part of the foundation of this country is exactly what that ideology speaks to. So it may not be what you aspire to, but in your code, you have a few lines that enable this to take hold. And until you acknowledge that, you can't fully deal with the problem.
All right, so we are going to take some questions here from the audience. Hopefully I can read these. This one says, you are obviously well-read and well-educated about the world. As a child in apartheid South Africa, were you able to access and use the public library? If not, how did you get access to books and information in that format for your worldview, and that formed your worldview? An interested librarian.
I was a huge bookworm as a child. I still am. I wasn't allowed outdoors, and so the books took me outdoors. I could be in any world. So when I was very young, no, I wasn't allowed in a library. And if we did have libraries, they would be severely, understocked and undersupplied. But I was lucky in that, and I don't take this for granted. The reason I say I was born a crime and not I lived as a crime is because my country did change. My life did change. I'm young enough to be in a space where I got to enjoy the benefits of democracy and a country moving. I'm old enough, though, to have experienced the old regime and a transition and a change. And so when I was very young, the only books I had access to was predominantly the Bible. That's what I read with my mom. That's how I honed my reading skills. And when I was 5 years old and apartheid was on the verge of crumbling, I was really lucky in that my mom managed to get me a scholarship from a company she was working for. And they would pay for some of their staff to get their kids going to good schools. And I got to go to a private school at the time. And at that school, we had a really good library, and I got to take out books all the time. And so I had access to a world that many children didn't have access to. And that was the one thing my mom fed me, was just books, 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 books. She just constantly bought me books. At every yard sale, she would find new books for me to read. And that's really how I built up what little I knew. It's still how I live my life. I couldn't afford a tertiary education. My mother couldn't afford that, and we were saving up. And in the process of saving up, I started working, and I've been working ever since. But in terms of reading, I don't think there's any excuse to not know more. There's, as a librarian, you know this better than anyone. It's a beautiful resource. Just read. It seems like such a simple, stupid thing, but just read. It's funny. Like I hear people saying this all the time. You get white people, for instance, saying, "Oh, but how do we get in touch with what's happening in Black America?" You're like, there are books. There are books. You don't have to go to Compton and be down with the brown. You can just read a book, and that book can take you into the hood. It can teach you. It can make, a book helps you live somebody's life. People go "Oh, but it's so hard to relate to the Black experience." I'm like, that's a bullshit excuse when there are books. I can tell you how to cast spells in Hogwarts. I've never been to Hogwarts, but I read books. And so anyone who says they don't understand the world, I'm like, that's why books exist.
You could also talk to a Black person, but that's just me.
Well, that's the next step. One step at a time.
I get crazy. But I think they sorted these just right, because the next question is, what are your top 3 favorite books?
What are my top 3 favorite books? Oh, that's tough. I don't think I have favorites. I love autobiographies. I love books that delve into the whys of what has happened in the world. So I can tell you what I'm reading now, for instance. There's a great book I'm reading now. It's actually about California and crime. It's called Ghetto Side by Jill Levy.
From the LA Times.
Yes, an amazing, amazing book. Read it. Even if you just want to understand California and Los Angeles and crime, it will open your mind to a world. I was shocked. There were things that I learned where I was like, I didn't know. A beautiful, beautiful book that really, really enlightens you. I loved, I'm trying to think, there's so many books, Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me was a fantastic, fantastic book. And then I try read anything, but my favorite books of all time, honestly, it's fantasy. I still, you can't, I'm voracious when it comes to the Harry Potter, everything, I grew up reading the Chronicles of Narnia. That was my world. Any book, you know what, it was funny enough, it was any book where I could relate to an outsider. That's what Harry Potter was. He was this outsider in this world. He, for so long, didn't think he belonged, and then the next thing you knew, he realized he was just in the wrong place, and he could work towards something. The Chronicles of Narnia were the same thing. It was just like this world where these kids became more than they thought they could be if they were in another world. My favorite book of all time, or favorite author, is Roald Dahl. All of his stories, the way he writes, the way he processes the world. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, probably one of my favorites. Poor kid, came out of nowhere, got a golden opportunity to go see this magical man's factory and the way he did things, and then he was given that world and it became his. And I always think that's what happened to me with Jon Stewart. So, like, when I read that story, I go, this is, yeah, that's a documentary of my life.
So now I have to ask, since I know you're a Harry Potter fan, Ravenclaw, Hufflepuff, Gryffindor, Slytherin?
Oh, I actually...
Ravenclaw. I think so too.
No. I'm Gryffindor. You have to be. It's
2 points for
Gryffindor.
Gryffindor. All right, so this one is from Queenie. Queenie is very proper and says, Mr. Noah, you're amazing.
Thank you, Queenie.
Is your immigration status stable okay? In light of the incoming
That's funny.
Trump administration. By the way, you're rocking The Daily Show.
Thank you very much, Queenie. Yes, I have a green card, and what's funny is, because I'm not in exile, nor do I come from a war-torn country, I do not suffer from the fear of being deported. I am wary of Donald Trump, and he is a very sensitive man who I do take at his word when he says he will try and change the libel laws in America in terms of, and he'll find ways to temper the press. And I'm glad he met with the press the other day off the record so that we know exactly what's going on. I think that was really helpful for everyone. But I'm not worried. I have my green card. If I get kicked out, I get kicked out, because that's the great thing again about living in the world. You can't stop a message anymore. That's why the Arab Springs happened. That's why protests happen all over the world. You can't stop a message anymore. So if they can kick me out, but they can't kick my message out. They can't, and they can't kick any of our messages out.
So I'm not sure that you would agree that you are a political pundit. Would you agree?
No, not at all.
Because this question is, as a political pundit, how do you balance your role as an entertainer versus an educator? But that's not what you consider yourself,
I don't consider myself a pundit at all. In fact, I hate many pundits. Why? Because pundits say they know. I always say I don't know. I love asking why. That is my favorite question to ask, is just the why. Everyone knew in this election. Everyone knew. And you know what? One of the angriest moments I've had during this election, I don't get angry often. One of my angriest moments was just after Donald Trump had won the election, and the pundits were on TV and they were like, well, clearly the polls got it wrong. I mean, the numbers had Hillary up and the polls got it wrong. And what happened? Well, as you can see, what happened here was the polls show us that the people who voted for Trump, and I was like, wait. Did you just tell us the polls were wrong and then use polls to tell us why polls were wrong? You didn't even take a moment to breathe. You didn't even take a moment to go, maybe we need to think before we... I get so frustrated because everyone knows. You tell someone, hey, you were wrong. And they go, yeah, well, let me tell you why I was wrong. I know why I was wrong. I get angry with that. I go, we don't ask enough questions. We don't. I'm not a pundit. Whenever someone says they have the answer, I'm wary of that, because the pundits has essentially become a job description because it's needed to be something that that exists on cable news 24 hours. You need to fill it with somebody, and so those somebodies will come to be there. It's supply and demand. But the truth is, many of us don't know. Just ask the questions. If you just ask the questions, you will be in the right place. So in terms of balancing my role between entertainer and pundits, not pundits at all, entertainer and educating, I'm educating myself. And I'm proud to say that I don't know, and I'm proud to say that I love learning. And I see the Daily Show audience as an audience that is experiencing that. Yes, we have a lot of older viewers who have, come with us from Jon Stewart, But I'm excited that we have a new wave of millennial viewers who go, we're getting engaged in this, we're learning this for the first time. Why? And I believe when I ask the questions, we find the answers. So essentially, that's the best way to learn. My friend is a lecturer in South Africa, and he lectures in accounting. And I said to him, "Do you wish you worked in the private sector?" And he said, "To be honest with you, I think I'm an amazing accountant because I teach every single day." And he said, "Because by teaching, I have to remember to learn, and when I learn, I remember how to teach." And so that's the way I see it on the show. It's just like I find it entertaining. We make jokes, but let's learn about it together.
You actually talk about this in the book. This is an interesting question. Being half black and half white, have you ever experienced white privilege? Which you have in South Africa.
I haven't experienced white privilege, but I have experienced privilege. Yeah. And one of those instances was in my family, my grandmother and my grandfather, because they were deeply entrenched in the laws of apartheid, my grandparents never disciplined me. They were petrified, because in their world, exacting any form of discipline on me was breaking the law. You know, my grandmother, we grew up in a matriarchal household, in a matriarchal society really, because a lot of black men were sent off to work in mines, or they were taken away from their families and arrested because they were protesting. So a lot of families were matriarchal, and punishment was dealt by the grandmothers or the mothers, and mothers were often working, so grandmothers were raising the children. And my grandmother would, she would spank all the kids in the family except me, because she was petrified. And the best example was there was one day, my cousins and I were playing house. We were playing doctor, and I was conducting surgery on my cousin, and I was using matches in her ear. And during the surgery, I perforated her eardrum. These things happen, there's no guarantees. And so she started crying, and she was bleeding, and my gran came in, and she was like, "What happened?" And she cleaned the blood, and she was frantic. And then she started spanking my cousins, plural, for what they had done. And then she turned to me, and she just looked at me, and then she ran out the room crying. And that night, because my mom used to spank me. My mom, she did not spare me at all. That night, my mom came home, and my gran was crying, and she's sitting there, and she's like, "Ooh," and she goes, "Oh, Patricia." She said, "Trevor is so naughty. He's such a naughty child." And my mom says, "Yeah, so you must hit him then." And she says, "No, I can't hit him. Ooh, I don't know how to hit him." She says, "I've never hit a white child before." She says, "I don't know what to do." She says, "I don't know how to hit him." She says, "Black children, I can hit them because I know what's going to happen. With a white child, they turn blue and green and red and yellow. I don't know what's happening. I'm going to break him. I'll go to jail. I don't want to hit a white child." And I remember, at that time, I didn't think of it as race. I thought of it as Trevor. I thought that this is just a coincidence. My skin just happened to come out this way. I did not live in a world of race yet. And so in my world, I was like, "Oh, wow. Trevor doesn't get hit because his skin shows bruises. Good times." And now in that situation, and that's really what acknowledging privilege is, in that situation, I realized that my cousins would be punished more severely than I would for committing the same crimes. And I could have easily stepped forward and said, "Hey, I don't think this is fair. I too should be punished equally." But the truth is, privilege is really nice. And so instead, what I did was I stood by and I was like, "Well, I feel bad for you guys, but hey, I mean, that's life. That's life."
So this question is from either Shani or Shani. Shani? What makes you most happy in America?
Say it again?
What makes you most happy in America?
What makes me most happy? Oh, it's the same thing that makes me happy anywhere in the world, is surrounding myself with great people. That's one of the greatest gifts I've been afforded in my life, is I've really developed a wonderful network of human beings who I surround myself with. I'm still friends with people, my closest group of friends are from South Africa, and we've been friends for 15 years now. So this was long before any type of fame, and I continue to develop wonderful friendships now in the US. But your friendships and your relationships can take you home no matter where you are in the world. So every memory I have, and I'm sure it'll be the same for everyone in the audience, you often attribute it to what you did or where you were, but the truth is, it's who you were with. So what makes me happy is sharing moments and experiences with the right people.
Okay, sorry. Yes, you can clap for that.
Oh, it's not necessary. I mean, it's not.
All righty. Do you think the intensity of your wit and humor about Trump helped or hurt his campaign for president?
I think.
Or mattered at all?
No. It's a valid question.
Yeah.
But I think what you have to acknowledge is we live in a world where increasingly people are not communicating outside of their bubble. We exist in echo chambers, and those echo chambers have expanded. You know, it's not now just our TV shows. It's our social networks. Algorithms have been designed to keep you within your bubble, so you are not exposed to something that you may not like, and so your mindset is reinforced. So, if anything, there may have been moments where the show broke through that bubble and was spread amongst people who wouldn't have necessarily come and watched the show. But what I've come to learn is that bubble is really becoming more and more reinforced. And if we're not careful, it feels like America will get to a place where politics will almost become like a blood type, where it is no longer a decision people are making based on the information presented to them, but rather it is given to them at birth, and that is what defines them for the rest of their lives. So I don't think I particularly either benefited Trump or detracted from him. I don't feel that most people who are fans of The Daily Show would have ever considered voting for Donald Trump. And I don't think that anyone who voted for Donald Trump would have been swayed by what I said. The greatest challenge we're going to face moving forward, if we wish to move forward, is finding a way for facts to exist beyond that. Because we are living now in a post-truth era. Where now people go, I don't care if it's the truth or not, it reinforced how I felt, and so I accept it. And that's more important to me than anything else. And Donald Trump is really going to put that to the test. He is going to be the stress test of America's democracy, and more importantly, its press. If ever the press was needed, if ever the fourth estate was needed, this is that moment, because those publications are what people see. It's subconscious. We don't even realize it. When you walk in an airport, or you drive down the road, those headlines are subconsciously imprinted in your brain. They can tell you that Lindsay Lohan is having a breakdown. You don't even realize that it's going into your mind, but you'll find yourself in a conversation one day and someone goes, Lindsay, you go, oh, she's actually having a breakdown. Yes. And people don't realize how powerful that is. Even if it's a newspaper that you don't read, that information is still coming to you without you realizing it. That's why people advertise the way they do. And I think that's where we will all be looking to. It's looking to the press. And strangely enough, it's also realizing that we as individuals are becoming, in essence, our own press. You look at how stories are disseminated on Twitter and Facebook now. It's individuals. There was a guy who tweeted a story from Austin, Texas. He talked about how he saw Trump protesters being bussed in. And his tweet reverberated and expanded. It was 15, 20, 30,000, views and retweets and reblogs and Reddits, only to find that it wasn't a fake protest. It wasn't people being bussed in. He saw a group of buses, and those buses were there for an event that was being held by a company. They were doing, a huge function. And he never checked. He didn't try, because he said in his words, I didn't think it was that big anyways. Like, I have a few hundred followers. So I was like, well, who cares if I get it wrong? But now we're realizing that, we have to be twice as vigilant. And some people go, well, Trevor, you can't put that on all of us. We can't do that. I think we've done it before, and that was whenever there's a spike in counterfeit money, we all get used to putting our currency up to the light. And that's something we're going to have to do now with every piece of information we get. We just have to hold it up to the light, because we know how dangerous it can be if we don't.
So this was a question I had also. Are you planning to interview the new president-elect on your show?
Am I planning to interview?
Yeah, or if he was willing
I'm not
to
planning
appear.
to. Yeah, I'm not planning to, but I'll have Donald Trump on the show. We were always open to having Donald Trump on the show. What I won't do, though, is normalize him. What I won't do is now exist in a space where just because a person has achieved a title, I think there is a disconnect that happens sometimes in America, and I've noticed it even over the past few weeks. A lot of people now go, well, now he is president-elect, and so we must afford him, a certain, and then I go, well, slow your roll just a little bit there. Because just because the person has achieved that position doesn't mean that they always deserve that position. And more importantly, we must never forget that in any democracy, those people work for the people. You are hiring them with your votes. They are accountable to you as a constituent. It's not the other way around. That person is not your boss. You have employed them. And so you have to hold them accountable. You have to make sure that you speak out when you feel they're not doing something right. And I was a beautiful quote. I think it was Truman who said, just because, I'm paraphrasing it, but the idea is just because somebody's your president doesn't mean you shouldn't question them, doesn't mean you shouldn't challenge them, because that in of itself is treasonous to the betterment of the country as a whole. And that's what people should think of. It's America and it's democracy first. No one person should come above that. So we'll have him on the show. I will be respectful to him as I am to any guest who comes on my show. Everyone who's come on my show is a guest. Even if I fundamentally disagree with them, they are a guest, and I treat them accordingly. But what I don't do is change my points of view because they're now in the chair. What I don't do is now temper myself to appear in a way that I'm not. A good example of that was Ben Carson. He was gracious enough to come to the show. We make tons of jokes about Ben Carson. He knows this, but he came and he sat in a chair next to me, and I was respectful to him, but I still made a joke about Ben Carson. I still sat opposite him, and I said, I'm Ben Carson. And, and he turned to me and he said, I don't speak like that. And I mean, the most important thing is that we're existing in a space of honesty. But I do respect you as a human being. And, and a good example of that for me was like what the cast of Hamilton did. Not the booing in the audience, but the people on stage, what they did for me was beautiful because they engaged in an honest manner. They said, hey, we're not trying to be confrontational. We are being honest with you because you're in our space. We would like to share this message with you, and we would like you to hear it. And the way people interpret it is up to them, but the point is they said what they needed to say. And that's how we'd approach it on the show as well. Plus, I will say this. Someone asked me the other day, it was actually Terry Gross on NPR. She said to me, did you ever think that you would be in this position where now Donald Trump would be the president that you would have to be skewering or satirizing every day? Don't you find that strange, You were mocking him when you came in. You were both seen as outsiders, and now in a strange form of simpatico, you are now going to continue your journeys together. And I said, it goes to that question of how would you treat Donald Trump and who is he to you? I think if you think about it, when Donald Trump, before he ran for president, he spent many, many years, all of Obama's terms, really. He spent in Obama's entire term as president, he spent that time mocking him. Donald Trump spent time questioning him, questioning even his citizenship. He never relented. Donald Trump was constantly lambasting this half black, half white, half African man. And I think it's only fitting that now, when Donald Trump is in power, he gets lambasted by a half black, half white, half African man. I feel like it all comes around. It's the circle of life. Hakuna Matata. That's what it is.
All right, so we will end on this question. I feel like I know the answer. Who is the person you admire the most?
Who is the person I admire the most? I would be lying if I said it wasn't my mom. It's obvious because I've written it, but that's genuinely what happened. I realized that, in fact, writing the book. I did not know that for certain. I have lived and appreciated and loved my mom my whole life, and I'm genuinely lucky that we have a very close relationship and we've always been a unit. but I don't think I fully appreciated what she did, what she went through, and what she gave me in life. Not physically, but emotionally and mentally, you know, opportunities and ideas. And when writing the book, by the time I got to the end of it, it was me coalescing ideas and stories, and I came to realize that I intended to write a book that was just about me and my experiences. And in the end, through telling the truth of my life, it became a love letter to my mom. And that, without me trying, made me realize that she is the person that I admire the most. She's the person who I aspire to be. But more importantly, and this is what my mom has instilled in me, is I aspire to be better than her. Because that's what my mom said to me. She said, the greatest thing we should instill in our children is that every generation should aim to be better than the previous one. Every generation should aim to grow. So, you know, she said, take my mistakes and you don't repeat them. Take the things I didn't do and you do them. Go out there and be better and make sure your children are better and those children are better. And if everyone lived like that, we'd be in a, you know, in a much, much better place. So, yeah, easily my mom.
Good mom advice. Well, thank you so much, Trevor Noah, for being
so
here.
much.
Thank you all
I
so
really had a
much for
great
being
time.
here.
Thank
Born
you for
a
coming
Crime.
out.
Go buy it.
Thank you for enjoying the book. I appreciate you. Thank you.